All right, hey everyone, fellow UPSC aspirants, welcome back for another deep dive. We try to bring you these deep dives to help you prep for your mains and your prelims and stay on top of current affairs.
Yeah, and you know what? Today's topic is a perfect example of something that could easily show up as an essay topic, so it's worth really paying attention.
For sure, we're going to be talking about the Arunachal Pradesh Freedom of Religion Act. You might have heard of it. It's been making headlines recently, and there's a lot of debate swirling around it.
Yeah, and what makes this even more interesting is that this law has actually been around for like 46 years, but it's never been enforced, and now suddenly there's this big push to implement it.
Okay, so right off the bat, we've got a bit of a mystery here.
Yeah.
A law that's been dormant for decades
Yes.
suddenly comes back to life. Why now? What's changed? And what does this have to do with us UPSC aspirants?
Well, think about it. This whole situation touches upon so many themes that are relevant for the UPSC exam. You've got freedom of religion, state intervention, cultural dynamics, the protection of indigenous communities. It's like a textbook case study on some of the biggest challenges facing India today.
Okay, so before we get too deep into the weeds, can you give us like a quick recap of what this APFRA actually says? What's all the fuss about?
Sure. So, in a nutshell, the APFRA, it aims to prevent what they call forceful religious conversions. Basically, it says that anyone who wants to convert to another religion has to report it to the authorities.
Okay, so on the surface, it sounds kind of straightforward, but I'm guessing there's more to it than meets the eye, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the law itself is pretty short, and the language is a bit vague, and that's where the controversy comes in because critics are worried that this vagueness could lead to all sorts of problems like potential misuse or, infringement on people's right to choose their own faith.
So it's like, where do you draw the line between protecting people from coercion and respecting their individual religious freedom?
Right. Exactly. It's a super tricky balance, and that's why this issue is sparking so much debate. And, one of the big things fueling this whole push for implementation is the fact that Christianity has grown a lot in Arunachal Pradesh in recent decades.
How much are we talking about here?
Well, in 1971, less than 1% of the population was Christian, and then by 2011, that number had jumped to over 30%. So it's a pretty significant increase, and understandably, that's raised some concerns about how that might impact the region's indigenous faiths and cultural practices.
Wow, that is a huge jump. So I can definitely see how that would make some people nervous. Like, if your whole community's way of life is changing rapidly, you're bound to have some strong feelings about it.
Right, and that's where groups like the Indigenous Faiths and Cultural Society of Arunachal Pradesh come in. They're big proponents of implementing the APFRA. They argue that it's crucial to protect their unique cultural heritage, especially traditions associated with the Danyapolo faith, which is indigenous to the region.
So their argument is that it's not about suppressing Christianity or any other religion. It's about safeguarding their own traditions, which they feel are under threat because of these rapid changes.
Yeah, exactly. And, one of the things they're really pushing for is stricter enforcement of that reporting requirement for conversions. They say, look, if we're going to have this law, let's at least make sure it's being followed so we can actually track what's happening and understand the impact of these religious shifts.
It's like they're saying, let's have some transparency so we can have an informed discussion about this whole thing.
Hmm.
But I bet not everyone is on board with this idea of the government keeping tabs on people's religious choices, right?
Oh, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of pushback coming from Christian organizations, in particular groups like the Arunachal Christian Forum. They're planning a huge rally to protest this whole thing, and they're calling for the law to be repealed altogether.
And what are their main concerns?
Well, they're worried that this law could be misused to target and harass Christians, leading to discrimination or even violence. And they point to examples from other parts of India where similar laws have been used to justify attacks on Christian communities.
I see. So for them, this isn't just some abstract fear. It's a very real and present danger based on what's happened in other parts of the country.
Exactly. And that's why this whole situation is so tense. It's like you've got these two sides with very different perspectives and very real fears, and it's all playing out against this backdrop of rapid religious and social change.
It sounds like this is creating a lot of tension within the state.
Yeah.
I mean, with such strong opinions on both sides,
Yeah.
this could easily escalate.
Right,
Yeah.
and it's not just limited to Arunachal Pradesh either. I mean, you've got the Naga Baptist Church Council, which represents a big chunk of the Christian population in Nagaland. They've come out and said that this whole thing could have ripple effects across the entire Northeast.
So this isn't just a local issue anymore. It sounds like it could even impact relations between different states.
Yeah, Exactly. It's a very delicate situation because you got to remember that the Northeast has a very diverse religious landscape with lots of Christians in several states. So this is definitely something that's on people's minds across the region. And, speaking of other states, the Assam Christian Forum has actually drawn a parallel between the APFRA and a recent law passed in Assam that bans what they call magical healing.
Interesting. What's the connection there?
Well, they see both of these laws as attempts to target Christians under the guise of protecting public order or cultural heritage. It's like they're seeing a pattern emerging, and it's making them feel increasingly vulnerable.
It sounds like there's a growing sense of anxiety among some Christian communities in the Northeast. Like they're worried that their religious freedom is being slowly chipped away.
And, it's not just an abstract fear either. I mean, there have been documented cases of violence and harassment against Christians in other parts of India, often justified by accusations of forceful conversion. So these concerns are definitely not unfounded.
Okay, so let's bring this back to our UPSC aspirants for a second. This whole situation is like a crash course in some of the most important themes that come up in the exam. We're talking about the right to religious freedom versus the state's interest in maintaining social harmony. Plus, you got the whole issue of protecting indigenous cultures and the potential for conflict between different states. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, and that's exactly why it's so important to stay on top of current affairs, because this kind of stuff is what the UPSC loves to throw at you in the exam. They want to see if you can analyze complex situations, understand the different perspectives, and grapple with the potential consequences of different policy decisions.
So let's sort of break this down a bit for our listeners. What are some of the key legal and ethical dilemmas that this case raises? What should UPSC aspirants be paying attention to?
Well, first and foremost, you have to understand the fundamental right to freedom of religion, which is enshrined in Article 25 of the Indian Constitution.
Oh.
This article guarantees every citizen the right to freely practice, profess, and propagate their religion. However,
There's always a however, isn't there?
right, this right is not absolute. It can be subject to reasonable restrictions imposed by the state in the interest of public order, morality, and health.
So it's a balancing act. The state can step in, but only if they have really good reason, and it has to be within the boundaries of the Constitution.
Exactly. And that's where things get tricky, because supporters of the APFRA, they argue that this law is a legitimate way for the state to prevent forceful conversions and protect vulnerable indigenous communities from exploitation. They see it as a reasonable restriction on religious freedom in order to preserve cultural heritage and prevent social unrest.
But those who oppose the law, they're saying it's too vague and open to misuse,
Yeah.
that it basically criminalizes legitimate religious practices and creates a climate of fear for minority communities.
Right. They argue that the definition of forceful conversion is super unclear and subjective, which makes it easy for people to be falsely accused and targeted based on their religion. And they also point out that the law puts the burden of proof on the person who converted rather than on those alleging coercion, which makes it even harder to defend yourself against these accusations.
So it's like a legal minefield with both sides making valid points based on the Constitution and human rights. It sounds like a classic UPSC dilemma, where there's no easy answer and you have to weigh different values and consider all the possible consequences.
Exactly. And that's what makes this case such a great learning opportunity for UPSC aspirants. It forces you to think critically about complex issues, analyze legal arguments, and consider the ethical implications of policy decisions.
It's a real-world case study on the challenges of governing a diverse and multi-religious society like India.
And it highlights how important civil servants are in upholding constitutional values, protecting individual rights, and ensuring justice and fairness for everyone.
So for our listeners who are prepping for UPSC, let's connect this back to your preparation strategy. What are some key takeaways from this situation? What should you be focusing on?
Well, I think it's crucial to understand the historical context of religious tensions in the Northeast. This isn't a new phenomenon. There's a long history of conflict between different communities and anxieties about cultural identity, which adds another layer of complexity to what's happening now.
So brushing up on your history is a must.
Yeah.
What else?
Second, you need to be really familiar with the legal framework governing religious freedom in India. So that means knowing the relevant articles of the Constitution, key Supreme Court judgments on religious conversion, and international conventions on human rights.
Got it. Legal precedents are key. Anything else?
Third, you need to be able to analyze the socio-political dynamics at play. Who are the major players? What are they trying to achieve? What are their concerns? How might different policy choices affect relationships between communities and stability in the region?
So it's not just about memorizing laws. It's about understanding the bigger picture, the context, the potential consequences, and the human side of things.
Precisely. And that's where your analytical and critical thinking skills come in. You need to be able to evaluate different points of view, identify potential problems, and propose solutions that make sense both legally and ethically.
So this situation is way more than just a news item. It's a goldmine of insights for UPSC aspirants. It's a chance to see how legal principles, historical context, social realities, and ethical considerations all come together. And that's exactly what the UPSC exam is all about.
Yeah, it really shows how everything's connected. What might seem like a small local issue can suddenly become a huge national thing, especially when you're dealing with something as sensitive as religion and cultural identity.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a great lesson for you all. As future policymakers and administrators, you've got to be able to think beyond those individual subject silos. The UPSC exam is all about connecting the dots, seeing how different parts of governance, the legal, the social, the political, the economic, how they all fit together and influence each other.
So let's pretend we're sitting in the Arunachal Pradesh government offices right now, giving them advice on how to handle this whole thing.
Yeah.
What would you tell them? What are some of the most important things they should be doing?
Well, I think the first thing I'd stress is communication. They need to be talking to everyone involved, religious leaders, community representatives, legal experts, get everyone in the room and really listen to their concerns and try to find some common ground.
So it's about open dialogue, trying to build consensus from the ground up, not just imposing a solution from the top down.
Exactly. And any decisions about implementing this APFRA, it should be based on a really solid legal analysis and a deep understanding of what might happen socially, unintended consequences and all that. And, maybe there are other ways to address those concerns about religious conversions, things like promoting interfaith dialogue or strengthening initiatives that promote social harmony, or even investing more in preserving indigenous cultures.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like addressing the root causes of the anxiety that's fueling this whole debate, instead of just focusing on the legality of conversions.
Right, and if they do decide to go ahead and implement the APFRA, they've got to make sure there are safeguards in place, things to prevent misuse and make sure it doesn't become a tool to discriminate or harass people.
So things like really clear guidelines on what exactly constitutes a forceful conversion, strong accountability mechanisms, and maybe even independent monitoring to make sure the law is being applied fairly across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. And they need to educate the public about the law itself. What it actually says, what it means, and why it's important to respect everyone's religious freedom. It's about building an environment of understanding and tolerance, not fear and suspicion.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. We've really gotten into the weeds on a really complex and timely issue, and it just goes to show how even something that seems like a simple legal matter can get tangled up with people's deepest beliefs, cultural sensitivities, and all that historical baggage.
And for you guys, the aspiring UPSC folks out there, it's a great example of how your future role as civil servants is about so much more than just enforcing laws. It's about understanding how those laws affect people, navigating complex social situations, and finding solutions that uphold justice, equality, and freedom for everyone.
So to all our listeners out there prepping for those UPSC exams, we encourage you to keep digging into this issue. Read that Indian Express article that got us started research of similar laws in other states, and really think critically about the challenges and potential solutions. This is a gold mine of insights for your current affairs. Prep for essay writing, and most importantly, for understanding just how complicated governing India can be.
And remember, this whole journey isn't just about passing an exam. It's about becoming the kind of civil servants who can serve the nation with wisdom, empathy, and a deep commitment to the Constitution.
All right, folks, so that wraps up another deep dive. If you found it helpful, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave us a comment below with your thoughts and questions. We love hearing from you. Until next time, happy studying and best of luck on your UPSC journey.